Hi everyone, welcome to week 7. That's right, we're almost at that midpoint of the semester. In the middle of week 7, we'll be halfway done the semester. And I'm not saying this because I'm excited about it ending. Even though we're not in the classroom, it's been great to get to know some of you. We've been having some interesting discussions on Zoom. But I say this to try to comfort you because I know it's a difficult semester. The winter is almost always more difficult because it happens on the heels of the fall semester, and you know people wake up and it's still dark out, and the days are shorter. A lot of people are lacking sunlight, so it's a hard semester for a lot of people. That's even when we're not dealing with a pandemic. So I say this to comfort you. I don't know if it works or not. You can let me know. So this week, we're going into archaeology. So learning about the past through an archaeological approach, more specifically, and thinking about cultural remains. So up until now, in the weeks preceding this, where we talked about the ancient past and all these ancient hominins, we've been focusing a lot on the biological changes, and we would bring in culture too, right? Because we talked about stone tools, and we talked about creating fire, and we started talking about cultural adaptation because in anthropology we use that whole biocultural approach, right? Now we're going to explore cultural adaptation in a little bit more depth, and specifically, at this stage, by thinking about material culture. All right, and then throughout the rest of the semester, we'll be exploring other aspects of culture. But this is a starting point. So the corresponding chapter in our textbook is Chapter 8. How do we know about the human past? You might notice, if you're the kind of person that notices what goes in the slides and and you're comparing with what's in the actual chapter and what's in the quiz, you're going to see that there's a section that there's a couple. I always skip over some stuff because we can't cover everything. I skip over a lot of the technical stuff about, surveys and excavations, and that'll be an option maybe for the final project for those who are really keen on learning in more detail about that. I also skip over the stuff about subsistence because we're going to talk about that in a different week. So we'll come back to that section. So don't panic if you're like, hey, Jackie's not covering the whole chapter. Well, that would be impossible, even under normal circumstances. As usual, the quiz is due on the Thursday at almost midnight. I try to be funny. You don't have to agree. So this is we've seen this map before. We've seen it a couple times. It's from page 122 of your textbook. So it's just to kind of remind you where we left off and saying, Homo sapiens kind of wind up spreading throughout the world, and these are not the only spots where archaeological remains have been found, but there's the ones that are, some of them that are addressed in the textbook. But really all over the place, wherever humans have been, there can be archaeological remains, and not only from Homo sapiens, right? So archaeology also looks at other hominin species that existed early in our days and even before. So what is archaeology exactly? Broadly speaking, it's the study of prehistoric human societies and cultures. And if you're wondering why I put prehistoric in quotation marks or in scare quotes, and the textbook doesn't do that, is that my training in anthropology has taught me to kind of be critical of this idea of prehistory. You've probably all heard the term prehistory before and the difference between prehistory and history, and usually historians will say, well, it counts as history if it's happened after the invention of writing, and it's prehistory if it happened before the invention of writing. Now, if we want to be less ethnocentric than our historian colleagues, I pick on my historian colleagues all the time. I love them, but I have to pick on them with this. It's ethnocentric, actually, to make that distinction across the board, because there are a lot of rich cultures that up until colonial times did not have written systems, not because they were dumb, but because they didn't need them. And when we think about indigenous cultures here on Turtle Island, or what you know as North America today, the oral tradition has enabled and allowed people to survive for thousands of years existing in a relationship with the lands that people lived on. And you know, the oral tradition was the way in which knowledge about the environment and about people's histories and values were transmitted from generation to generation. So to make that distinction between prehistory and history would say that indigenous peoples here had no history until the colonists came and gave them one. And that is just, that's beyond ethnocentric, right? So and you know, so all that to say that writing didn't happen everywhere at the same time, and in some places it never emerged from local cultural context. Again, not because people were somehow primitive, which is another term I've called into question in this course, right? So keep that in mind. All right, so with that disclaimer done, I think it's an important one. So we can talk about what archaeologists do. And archaeological study is basically, it's primarily, not only, and we'll talk about this more later, but often the first basis of study of archaeology is material remains. And I talk about material culture in another slide and what that means, right? So basically we're talking about objects, things, right? Material remains as opposed to, say, physical or biological remains, which is what paleoanthropologists, that kind of biological anthropologist who studies all those fossils, you know, what we were talking about over the last few weeks. Obviously there's overlap. They're all both talking about ancient humans, and they work together, all right? So the idea is to learn how ancient peoples lived, and also to think about cultural changes. And remember, a lot of, you know, cultural changes have gone along with biological changes, so we're still sticking with that biocultural approach. And also to learn about cultural adaptation. So how, you know, speaking of cultural changes, a lot of these cultural changes, just like biological changes and biological adaptation, have to do with, you know, surviving in a specific environment. So, as I've mentioned, and I jumped the gun on that one, is, you know, the archaeologists work with paleoanthropologists and other scientists as well, you know, geologists and biologists, and so these aren't isolated, they don't work in silos, they kind of help work together a lot of the time. So what archaeology is not? So sometimes people who've heard of archaeology before coming into the course, often it's through popular media, and I understand, right? Why else would you, you know, why would you not think that based on popular media? But like everything, don't believe everything you see in Hollywood, right? Or in games. So we have Indiana Jones here and Lara Croft, who are kind of maybe two of the most well-known popular archaeologists. There are problems in terms of that kind of representation. I mean, it makes archaeology look like a lot of fun, right? But this doesn't typically happen, like the running away from giant boulders or needing to carry a gun. You know, one thing that is kind of true though, like especially when it comes to, you know, some of the Indiana Jones movies, is just going and taking stuff without permission from local peoples, and we'll talk about that later. That is something that has been a problem in archaeology. So anyway, I just wanted to demystify that a little bit. So just, you know, usually in class we'd have a little bit of a conversation around this, but you can think about this on your own, just in terms of like why, you know, given our biocultural approach, why is it important for archaeology and biological anthropology, especially paleoanthropology, to work together, and how does that enhance our understanding of human evolution? Right? So if any of you keeners want to have a conversation about this kind of thing, this is something you could bring to one of the Zoom discussions, and that could be fun to talk about. So, excuse me. There's a concept of the archaeological record in your textbook, and so what is that? It's basically it's a record. So it's kind of a collection of things, right, that scientists can refer to, and it includes material objects and structures created by humans and our hominin ancestors. So humans typically, like the authors of the textbook kind of orient this term human as including all the members of the genus Homo, right? So Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, us, and a few others that we haven't talked about. and the other hominins that came before that. So what they lump together as the Australopiths, all those species, all right? And where are these things found? They're found in archaeological sites, all right? So these are specific locations where there is evidence of ancient human culture. And if you're really keen, there's stuff on this chapter about the process of, finding sites and accessing them and things like that. So we talked about material culture before. So what is that? The textbook doesn't tend to use that term, but I find it useful to help tie this into previous conversations about culture that we've had in this course. Because we've talked about culture in week 2 and as this kind of set of beliefs and behaviors that people learn and share, right? So basically everything we think and do is part of that. And that includes material culture. And when we talk about material culture, it's items that humans used, and I should say actually use in the present tense. So tools, food that we eat, right? We cultivate plants, or we kill animals, or we process them, and they become things that we consume. This is material culture. This thing right here that you're seeing me through and that I'm talking to you through, that's material culture. My glasses, this silly hat, which is, it's not quite an Indiana Jones hat, but anyway, whatever. It's a dollar store. And by looking at material culture from the ancient past and through all the periods leading up to today, anthropologists can track cultural evolution, all right? And so we talked about biological evolution a lot, but there's also cultural evolution. And here and I'll get back to that, but evolution just means change, right? It doesn't mean things are better than something else. So just as an example, when we talked about, the different species of Homo, and we saw Homo habilis here, who were the ones who are associated with these Aldewan tools, and those stuck around pretty much unchanged for a couple million years. And you have Homo erectus, who is capable of creating something that was a bit more sophisticated, and maybe you'd use it for different things. And then you had the Mousterian tools here with the Neanderthals, right? So you can look at these changes, and this is an old chart, and there's some discrepancies here in one of the columns, because some of these are things that used to be questioned, but there's been more definitive proof since then. But you can kind of see, the kind of periods of time here, right? And you have, these Aldewan tools used by probably Homo habilis, and, the associated ways of life that went with that. And then as you get closer to kind of contemporary times with Homo sapiens, and starting about, maybe 8,000 years ago, KYA is 1,000 years ago, you start to have, more diversity in the kinds of tools that existed. So that's something that archaeologists have been able to track and kind of make associations with the things that they found and the way that people might have lived. And there are some archaeologists who do, archaeology in the sea. You don't have to go outside the city. My colleague Matthew Sasoyan, who you can see right here, and here, he's another anthropology teacher at Vanier. So if any of you, you might have friends taking this course with him right now, and if you are really into archaeology, Matthew offers a course called The Adventure of Archaeology every semester, and it's a course that can come after this one. So once you've passed this one, you are able to take that course. So if you're really keen on archaeology, look out for that course with Matthew. He's trained as an archaeologist, and he's really into it, and he's a lot of fun. All my colleagues are fun. So he used to, before he became a parent, he used to do all these, he would actually dig, at Vanier, and he would do the whole process here with kind of, measuring the squares, and, those of you who are keen, you can learn more about that, how that's done with the grids and everything, and the exact measurements, and these are some of the things that they found. And Matthew has he provided me with these pictures. It's from a PowerPoint that he put together that actually also documents the history of our campus. because it used to be a convent, and just kind of making those associations, right? So you find some old stuff here, and I don't remember what he told me about all these things, but some of them are bones, because there used to be fields out there with cows, and some of them are more recent finds, but there's knowing the history of the place helps kind of understand what some of these things might be. So archaeologists kind of do that as well. So it's interesting, right? There's a wide range of things that were found. So if you ever get a chance to take a course with Matthew and you're into archaeology, you'll learn a lot. So what are elements? What are things that are a part of the archaeological record? Well, you've probably heard of artifacts. This is a very commonly used term, and what it technically means in the field of archaeology is anything that was made or modified by hominins. All right, so again, there are sometimes things that are found in association even with pre-Homo species, although it's more rare because they didn't tend to use stone, right? But tools, clothing, pottery, modified stones, right? Which often wind up being tools. So basically, things are made or modified, and when we say modified, you can take a rock and just chip something off of it and it becomes a tool, right? So it's not always made from scratch, so to speak. But there are also features. Features are similar to artifacts in the sense that they're made or modified by humans, but they can't be moved without destroying them. So old fireplaces, temples, walls of buildings, ditches even, right? So a ditch is an example of modification. It's like the terrain was already there, but maybe people made a ditch to create a midden or an ancient garbage dump, right? Or for irrigation purposes or whatever, right? And if you move them, you destroy them. And then there are ecofacts. Now, ecofacts are really important too. They're biological remains of animal and plant life that humans likely ate. So if you find a location where a hominin species was active, and you find some of their stuff, you can see by maybe some remains of plant seeds, fossilized plant seeds, some animal bones. And you can look at the cut marks on these things. Are these something that they ate, and how did they obtain these things, right? So again, it goes beyond finding stone tools and pottery to all these other things, and that's really important to understand. And how are these elements interpreted? Well, there are other things to consider. So the textbook talks about provenance. So remember in one of those pictures of Matthew, I pointed out that kind of grid. Well, whenever they excavate a site, they'll have these big grids and these stakes in the ground. It's even more elaborate than what you saw with Matthew. That was kind of a mini demo thing. But they'll before they take something out, they have to measure, well, where is it within that square from either side, right? But also how deep it was. And so they always have exact measurements. And that's important because that'll help understand the context within which that object is found, which can help with the relationship to other, because the context is essentially the relationship to other items that are found around there. So if you have one of these squares or a few of them near each other and you find a pile of kind of very similar things, it tells you something. Or if that object is the only of its kind with other kinds of objects that the relationship is less clear, that leads to asking other kinds of questions, like, did this come from somewhere else? Was this a trade item? Or all kinds of things, right? Because remember, the goal of this is not just to find these things to say, oh, look, a thing, right? Although that can be pretty cool when it's a very, very old thing. You're like, oh my god, I'm touching an old thing. Like the Colosseum in Rome or something. But the idea is to try to use these things to piece together how people lived in the past, what they did, and what were some of the changes in these cultures. Okay, so the context and the provenance of the things that they find are as important as the things themselves. Taphonomy is another term that comes up in this chapter, and it's the idea of thinking of the processes that may have affected a site and the objects that are found in it. So over time, so say they found something that, and they're able, and there's all kinds of, we're not going into it, but there are all kinds of dating techniques, measuring the chemical components that they know change at a certain rate over time, or even stratigraphy, which looks at the layers in the ground and what things are older than other things. And they're able to often, be quite specific in how old something is. So if they find a very old site, say, a million years or 40,000 years old, well, then this is where working with folks like geologists and historians who know kind of, well, what's happened in that area since then, right? Places don't look the same as they did 40,000 years ago or a million years ago. Remember when we talked about the evolution of bipedalism, we learned that the forests on the African continent shrank, right? So things like that are important to know. Have there been floods or volcanic eruptions that may have shifted things around and moved them around from their original context? Also, as people around the world wound up living in different ways in different places, some people adopted different forms of agriculture. This is something we'll talk about eventually. And, so that process of working with the landscape in a particular way has altered some of these things as well. Warfare, looting, things like that. So these are all things that they have to know about, because they can't just take, oh, this thing is there and it's always been there for 40,000 years. Not necessarily. Okay. So here from page 155, you have a little graph. And again, we're not going into detail into this whole process, but archaeologists, it's like with anything else, right? You don't just write an essay. Well, I know some of you do, and I've done that too as a student, but when we want to be really good at it, we plan for it, right? We do our research and we prepare. So it's the same thing. They don't just pop up somewhere and just randomly start excavating. There's all this research that's done, looking at historical documents and maps and other studies before. If you've taken research methods, or you're taking it, now, like before you do your own research, you have to learn what other research is done, oral history, what do folks in the area say, and then kind of surveying, so checking the place out from the air, from the ground, things like that. Mapping things out, and then you get to excavate. And then you're not done. You have to do all these things to analyze it, and then kind of preserve it for for future study or for archives. So it's complex, and it's not all about being out in the dirt and digging. That's one small part of it. Ethnoarchaeology is something that comes up and is interesting to consider in terms of thinking of, well, how do we figure out what these things are, and what were they for, and how did people use them? So more and more archaeologists are also taking into consideration, well, okay, so in that area, we know, for example, contemporary societies in a certain area might have certain practices, that they can draw on to help figure out what was going on, because maybe similar objects are being used today by some peoples, and it's like, oh, they're using it that way, and these are the people in society who make them, and this is why, and this is how things have changed, say, in the past few hundred years. And so that can give hints about how things might have been done in the past, but they're only hints, because archaeologists who practice ethnoarchaeology are very careful, at least one would hope they were careful, not to be all ethnocentric and make assumptions about contemporary societies in question are being somehow primitive or fossilized cultures, right? Because that's unfortunately an easy leap to make for some people if they learn about people who up until they were colonized were still hunting and gathering or practicing very small scale agriculture. They might think, oh, they're somehow primitive. And no, actually, these are very adapted ways of life, and that's why they survived for so long. And they continue changing. So all cultures, so even if you encountered a culture today that was practicing hunting and gathering and fishing and weren't farming, well, they're not primitive. They've adapted, and so the way that they do it now isn't the same way that their ancestors did it 40,000 years ago. And also remember, just like with biological adaptation, what's adaptive in one spot may not be adaptive in another. So we have to be careful to avoid those kinds of assumptions. Now, speaking of cultural adaptation, the textbook doesn't really go a lot into that as well, but I think it's important to consider. And, well, what does that mean, right? Because, again, we talked a lot about biological adaptation, especially that happens on an evolutionary scale through natural selection. So when we talk about cultural adaptation, remember, we're talking about culture, so it's things that people learn and share, right? So ways in which people find ways to ways comes up twice in that bullet point. That's kind of weird, but whatever. So how do humans find ways to survive in specific environments? So the knowledge they have of the environment, skills related to that environment specifically, right? Activities. So what do? How do they get their food? Technologies that they use. So in some places in the world, if they're very well adapted to their environment, it wouldn't make sense to, say, have cars and fridges. You need different kinds of technologies to survive there, different kinds of knowledge. Programming a computer might be useless if what you actually need to know to survive is the migratory patterns of the animals and the fish. So environments offer possibilities and limitations, so they don't determine culture. Just like with biological adaptation, there's more than one way to adapt to one place, right? So you have forests, you have snakes living there, you also have some kinds of primates and and birds, right? They're all adapted in their different ways. So sometimes you'll have environments where there might be different ways of culturally adapting as well. So there are limitations sometimes. If you're in an environment where there's no fertile soil, agriculture might not be an option, right? But at the end, it doesn't determine culture, because there are still sometimes multiple possibilities. And cultural evolution, I mentioned that before, is a change. Like any kind of evolution, we're talking about change. It's a neutral idea. It's not the same as progress. This is from an older textbook that we used to use, but I think it's important. Cultural evolution is not the same thing as progress, all right? Because progress can have ethnocentric connotations. What I was saying before about not assuming that some cultures are primitive and others are more advanced, we don't talk like that in anthropology. Some older anthropologists used to, but that's really ethnocentric. So it's not about one culture being more advanced than the other, or one being more primitive. They're all adapted to their specific environments. Okay, so it's really important to understand that. But culture is more than stuff. Okay, so we've been talking about material culture, right? Stuff here being a fancy term for material culture, and it's hard to study things that are not stuff from the ancient past, right? So, because we can piece together objects and try to figure out who made what, but things like the meaning behind things, like any, say, ritual meanings, or what things meant to people, things about the differences in power between people within a society or between societies, that can be hard to piece together because nobody's left around to talk to, right? So that's kind of reflected a bit, these difficulties are reflected a bit in changes in archaeology over time and the goals of archaeology. So early on, and the textbook lays this kind of 4-stage thing out, where the very earliest archaeologists, it was pretty much about, look, there's a thing, or there's pieces of a thing, and we can put it together, and now we see a thing. And it was really that value of finding the thing and showing the thing and talking about the thing. Right? So then there was this other approach that came later, which is like, well, okay, things are nice, they're nice to look at, but we can use these things to try to figure out what these old cultures were like, right? And that should be our goal. And then came along with I remember learning about this in as a student back in the 90s, and they talk about this third stage as of the 1960s or so, where there was this thing called processual archaeology, which goes beyond just piecing together cultures, but learning about processes that contributed to these cultural practices and to the material culture that existed. So what was going on at the wider level, changes in the environment, changes in relations between societies, what are all these things that contribute to people doing the things that they were doing, right? So it's kind of like this more dynamic approach. And then more recently, there's been kind of a bit of dovetailing between archaeology and cultural anthropology, where there's this desire to interpret in a deeper way and try to, what I was saying it's hard, but how can we go about looking at these ancient societies and trying to consider, well, what did things mean, right? So when we talk about symbols and symbolic thinking and how that was a watershed moment in human evolution, right? Because it leads to cultural developments. So what were the symbolic dimensions of culture? And what were the social relations like? So, it's interesting to know, because again, like in any other scientific field, there's changes over time in what the priorities are and what the goals are, and that affects how people do things. And what comes up too in more contemporary times is ethical concerns. So we talked about Indiana Jones before, just going and taking stuff, and it should be in a museum. There are more ethical concerns today. Traditionally in archaeology, as in all of anthropology, by the way, including paleoanthropology, cultural anthropology, whatever, there's tended to be in the past, and sometimes today as well, a lack of respect for the meanings attached to the cultural and physical remains by the descendants of the people who left those things behind. So, archaeologists and other scientists have often felt like, oh, well, we're like grand Western scientists and we need to know this history, so we're just going to take whatever we want and we don't care if it's meaningful to you. So there's been a lot of theft of artifacts and skeletal remains by colonial powers, for example. Some of them are still sitting in museums in Europe and have not been returned. Belgium, I think, was in the news recently as pledging to return all the stolen stuff to different parts of where they tried to colonize, or they did colonize on the African continent. So they've pledged to return a lot of the things to the people in concern. In Canada today, and other places as well, but this is a Canadian textbook, there's an imperative for archaeologists working on Indigenous territories, which is everywhere here. It's all ancestral territories for one Indigenous population or another, sometimes multiple. So they must acquire, just like other anthropologists and any other scientists, acquire informed consent from Indigenous communities. And the focus also is on power partnerships. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So there, with these growing ethical concerns, but also these growing concerns with the symbolic dimensions of human cultures, that it's not just about stuff, there are kind of other considerations that emerge. So, for example, the textbook kind of gives 3 examples. There's archaeology and gender, Indigenous partnerships, and cosmopolitan archaeology. And so we'll talk a bit more about archaeology and gender, because that's going to come back later in the semester, and we'll touch on these as well. So in terms of archaeology and gender, traditional archaeology, again, like other forms of anthropology, there's been a tendency for Western white male bias. Now, this is not for the Western white men in the class. This is, nobody's saying that you're evil here, okay? This is something that was happening in all sciences because, there's still patriarchy in our current social context, but it was even more overt, say, 100 years ago. And so a lot of archaeologists at the time were Western white men, or other people such as Western white women, and occasionally some non-Western, non-white folks who were still trained in the Western academic tradition, and who still kind of had incorporated these biases into their thinking. So, for example, things like gender essentialism or biological determinism, which we'll talk about again when we talk about sex and gender, but this idea that there's one essential way to be a woman and one essential way to be a man, and there are only these 2 categories and nothing else. And that our biology determines who we are. And so how this would manifest is that in archaeology was the projection of gender norms of the researcher's time, so say 1940s USA, onto the past. Right? So you see this reflected in a lot of portrayals of ancient human societies where the man is the one running everything, is the one making all the stone tools, is the one hunting, and the women stay home and, I don't know, clean the cave or something. I don't know. But there are a lot of assumptions made just based on the worldview that these scientists would have. So these are, I mentioned some of these just now, right? So assuming that stone tools were all made by men, assuming and used by men, assuming female. So you might see sometimes these images of what they call sometimes these Venus figurines with a very large breast and a big belly, and there's an assumption. There has been assumption that they were necessarily about fertility. So if there's something associated with women, well, it has to be about fertility, because there was this assumption that women had no other role than reproduction, which is sexist as hell, right? And it still permeates a lot of this research. Assumptions about items buried with a person. So if they found us, and this is not from the textbook, but something else I've read before, if they would find a skeleton and they were able to determine that this skeleton was from a female individual, and if this female individual was buried, say, with a spear, instead of assuming that it was hers and that she was a warrior or hunter, they would assume that it was her husband's. You know? So that's something that's being rectified by feminist archaeology in recent decades, where there's more of a consideration and variation in societies past and present. So around the world and in societies today and, you know, recent societies, there's a huge amount of variation about conceptions of gender. All right, and we'll talk about that later this semester. Also changes over time within ancient societies themselves, because if you had a culture that was there for, say, 10,000 years, there were changes during that time as well. So that's, you know, we're getting on to, 36 minutes here, so I'm going to skip over these slides, but there's some, I give an example here over the next few slides of how this is played out, and if anybody wants to know more, we can, whoops, what happened here? We can look at this together. Maybe it'll come up in a discussion, but there are very real examples of how this sexist, patriarchal thinking has influenced old archaeological interpretations, and that more contemporary interpretations have led to different conclusions. So the other area that they talk about where kind of contemporary archaeology, it touches on something we talked about before, where traditionally there was a lack of respect for indigenous worldviews, not just here but all over the world, a lack of respect for indigenous territories and people's sovereignty over their own territories. From where they emerged, their ancestors came from, and lack of permission from indigenous peoples to dig up sites, right? So today, in Canada and in other places, there tends to be a more collaborative approach. So what I said before about how there has to be informed consent, and there are more and more archaeologists, and you can read about some of them in this chapter, where they're engaging in partnerships that not only are about consent and go, oh, do we have your permission to dig here, but actually working with people and seeing, well, what are their concerns? What does this mean to them? How will this help them? Right? And so also including indigenous worldviews and the oral tradition, place names that people have in their own languages, their knowledge of the landscape. I mean, indigenous peoples everywhere, to survive for so long in their ancestral territories, have this rich knowledge of their landscape and how it's changed over time, because this knowledge has been transmitted orally from generation to generation. So instead of kind of poo-pooing that and saying, oh, that's not real scientific knowledge, now more archaeologists are respecting that and kind of, trying to bring Western science and indigenous science together in archaeology. So that's a positive development. And the last thing that they talk about in terms of kind of contemporary forms of archaeology is kind of getting away from this traditional idea in archaeology where there was this imperative to excavate and take things out of their context, put them in museums, or, use them for the advancement of Western scientific knowledge. And a more cosmopolitan approach is to kind of recognize a range of viewpoints about how to treat material remains. So this ties in with our previous thing of partnerships with indigenous peoples. So there's more of a focus on conversation between cultures. And there's a nice quotation here on page 178 by an archaeologist named Chip Caldwell Chentapon. Probably not saying that right. But one group's notion of cultural preservation can be another group's notion of cultural destruction, right? So if an indigenous population says we leave it there, and if there's flooding and other natural things that happen to it, that's part of nature and that's okay. But to come in and take it out of its context is actually destruction, not preservation. To preserve it is to leave it in the hands of Mother Nature. So archaeologists who kind of take this approach are more willing to kind of accept these viewpoints. At the end of the day, so the main point, one of the main points here in discussing archaeology is that it's not like all sciences, it's not a static thing. So there's this continued analysis of gathered data and new data as well. So something might have been found 100 years ago, but with new analysis techniques, new knowledge, new information, new perspectives, you can kind of look at that data again, and kind of that continued questioning of everything helps lead to a portrayal of human cultural evolution. And we'll never know the whole story, but we can just get kind of meander our way to different kinds of things that we can know about the past and how things have changed over time, leading to the way things are today, always taking into consideration those biocultural connections. And looking at the increased specialization of material culture is interesting, because that's another sign of adaptation to local circumstances. So the first stone tools, for example, were very general and can be used for multiple things, and then over time you get more and more specialized as people kind of moved around a bit more and adapted to different places. So we have that here. And just last slide, I thought it was fun to just remind people that artifacts, again, don't only include things that are 2 million or 40,000 or 5,000 years old. They include some things that have been created in contemporary times. And tools are not just things like that little wrench, but, our mouse that we use, that printing press, can be a spear or a harpoon. But also even like a carrier for a baby. These are all tools. They're things that people use to adapt to their circumstances. So that's it for this week. As usual, if you have any questions, let me know. And if you're really keen on archaeology, like I said, you can go into more depth even by taking Matthew's course in the fall, hopefully in person. We'll see.